Hello, everyone. I'm Faria Nasruddin, a program associate with the Wilson Center's Middle East program and project lead on the Middle East Women's Initiative. I'm here today for another interview, an Ana Huna interview with Tara Kangarlou, a journalist, television host, and author. Tara is an award-winning American journalist, television host, and author who has reported, written, and produced for NBCLA, CNN, CNN International, Time Magazine, and Al Jazeera America, covering some of the most pressing issues in the US and around the world. Her experience ranges from covering global conflicts in the Middle East to international and cultural affairs, and she has previously served as a fellow at the East-West Institute as well as the McCain Institute for International Leadership. She's also a frequent contributor to various international news outlets covering MENA, foreign affairs, and humanitarian issues. Tara's award-winning debut book, The Heartbeat of Iran, was released in 2021, and in 2016, Tara founded The Art of Hope, an American nonprofit, the first of which was strictly focused on supporting mental health and psychosocial needs of war-torn refugees around the world. She's currently serving as an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, teaching on the power of humanized storytelling. Tara is here today to discuss with me two topics. The first one will be covered in this part, and the second one will be covered in a second part. Today, for this first part, we'll be talking about the 2-year anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death and the subsequent domestic political scene. Thank you for sitting down with me today, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So jumping right in, today, September 16th, on the day of the recording, is the 2-year anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death. And this past year has seen quite a bit of political change in Iran. The country has a new president and has seen a parliamentary election back in March. How would you describe where we're at now? And more broadly, how would you describe the current state of the domestic political landscape?
Faria, with regards to the domestic political landscape, given the recent presidential election in Iran over the summer that really came about after the sudden death of the previous president, the hardline cleric Ibrahim Raisi, along with Iran's foreign minister, what the election showed us is something that ties also with what happened in the immediate aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death, and that is this severe disillusionment and disappointment of the Iranian people toward their government, toward the Islamic regime. I want your viewers and audience to put some numbers in perspective. Out of the 60 million voters in Iran, only 60% in the first round and then 51% in the second election did not participate. So 60% in the first round and 51% in the second round of this election did not participate. So Pezeshkian only won with 20% of the votes, while majority of the people sat out. And this election, this last election, really saw the least number of participants since the Islamic Revolution in the previous 14 presidential elections. And why am I giving these numbers? Because it matters, right? Iran is the Iranian population is a population that is extremely educated. They are participating in the various social spheres across the country. And the fact that they did not vote and participate in the election is a direct reflection of their anger and disillusionment and apathy toward the government. And that ties with what the world saw in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death 2 years ago. And it's quite hard to believe that 2 years has gone by. But in short, Faria, Iranian people domestically are suffering economically, financially. They have been choked for decades, and they continue to suffer under the current setup. So are they hopeful? Not really. And again, we saw in the sort of coverage, the Western coverage of the presidential election over the summer, that they were framing or calling Masoud Pezeshkian a reformist candidate, a moderate, and so on, and sort of projecting this narrative of reform. But if you talk to the average Iranian, they know that this person too is part of the regime, is part of the system, because otherwise he would absolutely not have been qualified to run, nor would he really, have had the opportunity to win.
It's been 2 years. There's been so much change we've seen, and you're absolutely right. We've seen a lot of disillusionment amongst the Iranian people writ large. If you could
Mm.
delve a little bit more specifically on how you would describe 2 years later the mood of Iranian women activists and their allies, if you have a sense of their work, they're not only couched within this broader economic landscape that we're seeing, but have specific demands and specific sort of a relationship with the regime as well. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, sure. Um, a few things I want to touch on, if I may. What we saw in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's and the mass protests that were, Faria, met, as you saw and the world witnessed, with uh, an extremely barbaric and violent crackdown by the government of Iran, were not only encapsulating the demands of women, but also Iranian men and the whole of the society. And that is their anger and fatigue toward the regime and every single aspect of their governance. Whether it's human rights, whether it's social rights, whether it's the government's interference with the daily lives of people, students, workforce. Some of your viewers may not even know this, but Faria, did you know that in Iran, public workers, people who work in the public sector, have to show the stamp in their birth certificate that they voted? So some of these voters that even vote in these presidential elections or the parliamentary elections do so because the employers look for the stamp, right? So people are tired of the government's interference in all aspects of their lives, but also the perpetual disregard that the Islamic regime has shown toward the livelihood of the people. And I think, the last 2 years, the concept of the morality police and the hijab took the forefront because, of course, over the years, since the inception of the Islamic Republic, women's rights and women's suffering has been a tool for the regime to control the society and so forth. But people's grievances go beyond that, right? Over the years, one of the things that I've worked on and reported on extensively, and also in my book, has been this sort of exodus of the young, educated population in Iran, and the last couple of years have also been an example of such brain drain, and some numbers that I can share is every year, almost 3,000 nurses leave the country, and that is something staggering. And that's just one example, because I'm actually doing a piece on mental health in Iran. But whether they're scientists, engineers, nurses, doctors, young graduates. In a country where women actually are some of the, or actually rather make up the largest number of university graduates, these young, bright minds are leaving. Someone I was interviewing recently told me, Tara, we're no longer migrating, we're escaping, right? So when you talk to young people in Iran, they no longer think about, okay, where do we like to go? Right? They don't think about their choices, but rather they think about, okay, what's the fastest, easiest, cheapest way that we can leave for a better future, for an environment where we're not choked and when we're not robbed from our dreams and hopes. And that's really what's happening in Iran. 2 years ago, the world saw for the first time, I would say, the real face of Iranian people, 89 million ordinary people who, like yourself and people in our generation around the world, have the same hopes and dreams, a young generation that want to belong to the rest of the world. They want to engage with their counterparts around the world. And it was the first time that people around the world saw that and differentiated between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime.
All right, you mentioned disillusionment seems to be the consistent theme throughout not only generations, but across different sectors of the Iranian population.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's a gap in expectations or between different segments of the Iranian population, or more broadly, what are the expectations of young people, of young educated, this youth of the new government, either vis-a-vis women's issues specifically, or as you mentioned, vis-a-vis sort of the more general grievances that women's issues have touched upon as well within the country?
Um, First of all, I do want to mention that there are still so many political activists, journalists, women's rights activists who are in prison in Iran. Okay. So when you talk to the average Iranian, so many people see their real leaders in prison, people who can't raise their voice. And right now, 2 years since the protests that erupted all over the country, people also saw how they would be stifled, right? And the brutality of it in many ways prevents people from taking the streets the way they did, right? But that doesn't mean that the desire to bring about change is not there. It very much is. As far as people's grievances and the disillusionment, it is quite wide, and it's entwined in every aspect and element of people's lives, right? Whether it has to do with environmental issues. Faria, 75% of the Iranian population is at risk of water shortage. Iran's environment is on a downhill, and if not addressed, it's gonna crash at any time, and it's not going to be reversible. So whether it's human rights issues, women's rights, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of political participation, economic and financial challenges that people are grappling with, vast amount of corruption that is embedded in the Iranian society because of the government. Again, forget not that the Iranian regime holds the root to all of the powerful financial conglomerates. The private sector is extremely weak, and unless you are working with the regime, you can't succeed. So the list goes on. It's entwined in every aspect of life, and so people's grievances are exponential. It's not just one or two things, and so they have not seen any change, and quite frankly, they really don't have any hope in this new administration, who, by the way, I mean, it's very interesting. Some thought that the cabinet that the new president would introduce would somewhat be of these sort of so-called reformist or moderate candidates, but even that didn't happen. So I don't think that the Iranian people now in 2024 have the same belief that they once did back in 2009, perhaps, in some reformist candidate or moderate candidates to bring about this gradual change, or even those who voted for Rouhani twice. Some of those people didn't even vote. So this disillusionment is widespread and is embedded in all aspects of life.
It's incredibly sad to hear that, that since 2009, since 2022, maybe even in the short term,
Mhm.
the disillusionment has sustained itself. But I'm wondering, despite the disillusionment and lack of expectation in that administration, this new administration, has the momentum of the Women Life Freedom movement that we saw 2 years ago, sort of outside the expectations of the administration, diminished because of where Iran is in the current geopolitical moment, deprioritizing sort of the domestic scene, or maybe not deprioritizing, but being turned away from it? Or is the domestic landscape, the Iranian people, not concerned with this?
The way I would answer that question is the Iranian people saw how their youngsters, the young generation that took to the streets, their children, right, their teenagers, are arrested, are physically, sexually, mentally abused in prison. I've reported on this extensively, and so people don't go on the streets anymore, right? You know, as a parent, I'm not going to allow my teenager to go on the street, and so I'm sure many parents in Iran think that way, and those courageous teenagers and youngsters and the Gen Z in Iran, of whom we saw many of them on the streets, you know, they saw how they saw the brutality, right? So I think so much of why the protests subsided has been because of that, right? And also, any protest requires strong leadership if it's going to lead to a resolute ending, right? And that did not exist. Unfortunately, Iranian people very well understand that you know, the leadership, or rather the sort of political figures outside of Iran who want to in ways take charge of the movements that go inside of Iran, don't have the power and can't do much. And Faria, quite frankly, if you speak with Iranians from different walks of life in Iran, as I have, you know, both in my book and my reporting, and also even growing up in Iran, over the decades, very few Iranian people in Iran believe that the Western world, whether it be the United States or, you know, UK, care for the people of Iran. You know, they don't think that change is going to come from the West. They don't think that Western leaders are um, you know, concerned with their well-being, and that right now is you know, a prevalent narrative among Iranians, and so that ties to the sort of regional issues. So, in short, the reason we don't see people on the street is because of the way the protests were dealt with and this sort of lack of leadership. But the momentum is, again, still very much alive in people's hearts and minds. People want change, and people on a daily basis are risking their lives by you know, various forms of social political dissent, and that's why we continue to see arrests. You know, they may not make the headlines, but they are continuing, and also the executions in Iran. You know, they're continuing, but unfortunately, they're not making the headlines. But also, I would say when it comes to sort of the regional crisis, really, that we're seeing. Iranian people in the last, I would say, 4 decades have been so occupied with their own challenges domestically, right? In maneuvering and navigating on how to live life under the Islamic regime, and of course the terrible socioeconomic challenges that they really didn't pay much at. You know, they have been so immersed in their own suffering and challenges that you know, they did not much. I don't want to use the word care, but you know, they were focused very much on their own hardship, right, and did not engage in the hardship of the neighbors. Also, this is a very important nuance here, which is the Islamic regime over the years used the grievances of, let's say, the Palestinian people, or countries like Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, for its own benefit, right? To create this narrative and build this resistance, and the Iranian people see through that, and that's why they don't want to have anything to do with anywhere or anyone that they think their government, the regime of Iran, supports. And so that's why you know, there's this slogan in Iran that goes like "نه غزه نه لبنان جانم فدای ایران no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life for Iran, because the Iranian people feel that their regime is more concerned with others than the well-being of the people in Iran. And that's why they really don't engage in what goes on in the region, because they're so concerned with their own challenges.
Of course. Thank you for that, Tara. That was a very comprehensive introduction and overview of the past 2 years and beyond a little bit of the Iranian domestic landscape on this anniversary of Mahsa Amini and her death and the subsequent women life freedom movement in the country. I thank you for taking the time to discuss with me today, and we will move to part 2 to discuss your work in journalism a bit more broader and more specifically, as you touched on a little bit in our discussion today, mental health as well. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Faria.